Let me ask, have you ever had a really, really, really hard day? Like one of those days where you just want to go home and tuck into a little ball or a cave, maybe fall into your game, if you game, or your TV show. And I don't mean like the high drama, like all right, I can just melt and watch mindless television, and it's okay. Fall into a puddle? Yeah. As we head into today's encounter, that's the kind of day the disciples had had. Like, it was a good day with Jesus. This is earlier in Jesus' ministry. And for our family online, we're going to be in Mark chapter 5. But it's earlier in Jesus' ministry. So the crowds are just really beginning to gather. And in the midst of that, Jesus is in a house teaching, and the crowds are pressing in. And it says that his family came to get him because they thought he'd lost his mind. So this is before, well, most of Jesus' siblings weren't on board until after the resurrection, if you don't know that. But this weird thing happens, like they're outside saying, hey, we need Jesus out of there. And Jesus is like, that's not my family. My family's who's sitting in front of me, who follows me, who walks with me. Like, that's who my family is. Well, if you're one of the disciples, anybody but me think they felt a little proud? You're like, Pastor Jen, what's so bad about this day? Well, nothing so far other than it's a day of hard work where you pour it all out on the mat, right? Like you're leaving it all out there. And they get to the end of the day and the end of the teaching. And in Mark chapter 4, it said, that day when the evening came, he said to the disciples, let's go over to the other side. Now, if you don't know, the other side isn't where good little Jewish boys and girls go. The other side is like the other side of the tracks. Is like to those people, to those in-laws, to those people that don't think like you or act like you or talk like you, those people that you, what did we say last week? They thought they were dirty, unworthy. Caleb says, who's from Nebraska, says that's Iowa. Okay. Picking fights. Yeah, those people. I don't know what the disciples are thinking at that moment as they're getting ready to get on the boat in the evening to go to the other side. Maybe they're just thinking, Jesus wants to help us get away from the crowds. The crowds are following him everywhere they go, so maybe they think, oh, we can go over there where nobody knows us. And maybe we just don't have to be around those people. Maybe we're just going to tuck away and get a little rest. And so they begin the journey to the other side, and a tired Jesus who's been ministering all day conveniently goes down to the boat, inside the boat, and takes a nap. And a storm, a violent storm comes up. And half the disciples are fishermen, but they're scared. They're scared enough to go wake up the boss and say, Jesus, don't you care? Like, we're going to die. Who wants to end their very long, poured-out workday like that? Nobody? No takers. Online family? Any of you guys? No? Yeah. I wouldn't. And I'm an adrenaline junkie. I wouldn't want to end my day like that. And in the midst of it, Jesus gets up from his nap, and first he rebukes the storm and the wind and the waves. And then he rebukes the disciples. Oh, you of little faith, like, what is your problem? Have you not seen me doing all the things I'm doing, would be the implication that I read. But in the midst of that, the disciples are like, whoa. And they say, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Because this is before they've gotten to the point where they really understand exactly who Jesus is. And it doesn't say that they were awestruck. It says they were terrified. And so before we even get to this encounter, it's been a day. And there's been resistance didn't deter Jesus. I'm not sure the disciples were really excited about it. And I don't think for one moment the disciples thought they were going to get to the shore and have a whole nother day's work ahead of them. I'm guessing they just wanted to get to the shore and catch their breath. Ministered all day. Life and death experience to them. Jesus knew better, but in their minds, the waves are crashing and the wind is howling, and they have to wake Jesus up, and they literally think they're going to die. You know the adrenaline rush of that? Like when there's a car accident or an almost car accident, that moment when something happens that is so profound and shakes you so badly that you're just... And that's where they are as we begin today's encounter. They've already had a week of ministry in a day. And I want to invite you to read with me Mark 5, verses 1 to 5. It says, they went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. Okay. Let's get this straight. Like, what is going on here with this man? I mean, forget the disciples for a minute. How desperate must this man be? This account is actually in 3 of the Gospels. One of the accounts fills in the blank that he was naked. Here is this depraved man, tormented by demons, running through what we would say the graveyards, the tombs, all night long, howling. The community has tried to keep him locked down. Like, y'all, they have tried to put him in the loony bin. They have tried to move him to the insane asylum. They have tried to put him in prison on the psych lockdown ward. And in his strength and in his possession, he has broken every chain and broken every bond, and picks up the rocks and cries out and cuts himself under the oppression of darkness. Now, maybe you haven't physically been to that place, but have you been there emotionally, desperate, wandering, afraid, tormented by something that you can't get control of because it is controlling you? Had a burden on your back that is so consuming that you cannot exist a day without that burden and without that thing. That can look like all kinds of things, guys. Let's not just keep this in the demonic realm, right? What are the demons that try to possess, and if they can't possess, oppress us? Pornography. That'll mess up all your actual intimacy with someone. Spending uncontrollably, even though you know the thing that you are swiping that card to buy, 1, is not going to give you anything more than a temporary fix, and 2, is going to sink your credit further and further and increase the number of phone calls you get from the debtors looking for their money. It could be drugs or food or alcohol. It could be toxic relationships. There is a statistic, people who are abused by their partner, when they go to leave that relationship, it takes them multiple times, no matter how many times the police have shown up and the ER visits have happened. There is some binding that keeps them in torment and keeps them in that place. And sometimes, if we're honest, keeps us in the place. Maybe it's not physically dangerous, but it's a relationship that's so toxic that it poisons our everyday instead of bringing life. It might be crippling fear or anxiety that we so desperately want to be on the other side of, and yet it impacts us every single day. Knowing that what is got hold of us is dangerous or crippling, and yet unable to be free from it. I don't know about you all, but I've been there. And I walked beside people who were there. And it's not easy. It's terrifying. But Jesus doesn't leave us at terrified. Praise the Lord. It goes on in Mark chapter 5, verses 6 to 8. And it says, when he, the man possessed by the demons, saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man." Take off your church glasses. Be in this moment and picture this scene. I mean, let's go back. I told you to set aside the disciples for a minute. Let's go back to the disciples. The disciples who had a really rough, really hard, long, scary day. Oh, by the way, do you remember that it said at the end of the day, as the evening approached, Jesus said, "Let's go to the other side"? So as dusk was falling, they got on a boat. Then they encountered a big storm. Then Jesus saved them. Now the demon crazy guy is coming at you, and it is not light. It is not sunshiny. It's nighttime. Can we just talk about the fact that that's even scarier? Like, you can almost insert the scary music at that point, right? Like, it is dark. It is scary. There is a crazed naked guy coming at you, running straight at Jesus. You know what we don't see here? We don't see bold, courageous Peter stepping out of the boat to walk on water. We don't see him pulling out a sword to lob off somebody's ear. I guess he's not there yet. I think more than anything, Peter just wanted to get back on the boat and pull away no matter what the storm might be. The disciples have no idea what is going on. But you see, this is not a demonic ambush. It is a divine appointment. There is no battle of good and evil here. Nobody, the disciples might be afraid of the monsters, but Jesus is not. You see, in this moment, the demons know who Jesus is, and they are compelled to bow down. And I don't want you to think that that's bow down in worship. They are bowing down in submission. And they say, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Rewind. 30 minutes, an hour before, what was the question that the disciples had asked? Who is this that even the wind and the waves would obey him? They are still trying to grapple with who Jesus actually is. And the man with all the demons shows up and says, "Jesus, Son of the Most High God." And the answer to their question comes not from the Pharisees and not from their religious teaching and not from their own hearts, but from the demonic world itself, the other side. What a teaching moment. What a teaching moment. Hey, side note, not in my notes at all. Don't shut your ears off to people who aren't Christians, because God will teach you through them. Oh, he will school you. He will school you through them. Church, we want this full gospel all the way through Revelation. We want the crucifixion and the resurrection Disneyana version of the gospel, where when we go to spread the gospel, rainbows and singing birds and talking chipmunks go 5 steps ahead of us everywhere we go. But I got to tell you, what we see in this encounter and what we see over and over is that Jesus may take you some of those places, but he will also call you straight into the depths of hell on earth to take the gospel there. And I want to remind you to be strong and courageous and do not be afraid, because the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. I want to remind you that Jesus will call you and be with you wherever he has called you. But the reality is that somebody has to carry the light into the depths of the darkness. And church, sometimes that is going to be us. It's going to be us. But I want to have a little teaching note right here. I said that this account is in 3 of the Gospels. In one of the Gospels, it says there are 2 men who are possessed by demons. And I think that at the moment Jesus said, come out of this man, the one guy, the demon goes out and he becomes not important to the story. Almost like a big football play. There's 2 teams on the field, but we talk about the interception or the fumble, right? Or the touchdown. So as you read through different accounts of this, don't be surprised by it. Just know that 2 of the Gospels focus solely on what is about to happen here, because it is so much bigger than the casting out of a demon and a man. You guys have the scene, right? Let me make sure we're there. It is nighttime. It has been a long day. The disciples are tired and confused and had just been afraid for their lives. They're exhausted. And this crazed man naked comes running from the tombs, which, by the way, the Gentiles are fine being around dead people. But Jewish people, remember, that makes them unclean. You can't be around a tomb. You can't be in those places. And so the unclean naked guy is coming straight for them, straight for Jesus, and falls at Jesus' feet and bows down and begins to proclaim who he is. And Jesus says, get out of him. Read with me verses 9 and 10. Then Jesus asked him, what is your name? My name is Legion, he replied, for we are many. And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. Yeah, I want you to go full on special effects, because I think kind of that's what happened. Jesus says, who are you? And I don't do a big scary voice, but some big scary voice is like, my name is Legion, for we are many. A Roman legion of soldiers numbered between 4,600 and 6,000. 4,600 and 6,000. Now, do we know that there were exactly that many demons? Is this literal or is this a metaphor? We aren't sure, but we know there are many. At a minimum, there is a multitude. I want you to think of the trauma of being possessed by one demon, much less a multitude, sometimes working together to take you to the depths of the darkest place in conjunction with each other, and sometimes in the chaos, pulling you in all the different directions. And this is his reality. And yet Legion knows his place, and Legion is bowing down, cowering to Jesus, begging not to be sent away. And in the midst of all that, we might miss the fact that Jesus sees the man through his bondage. Jesus sees the individual person past his torture and his torment, past his addiction, past his whatever the thing is. Jesus sees our sin separately from our souls, and his love isn't based on our good behavior or not even the state of our hearts. For while we were still sinners, while we were still enemies of God, Christ came for us. Y'all, that's some good news. if we're honest, that's some news we need to remember when we are driving through or walking through some of the darkest places where people are surrounded and overwhelmed and burdened by darkness and despair and sin and desperation and addiction. Because if we're going to be the hands and feet of Jesus, then we also need to see the person separate from their sin. You see, church, our sin problem needs fixed. But more importantly, and first and foremost, our soul needs freed. I want to let that sink in for a minute. Because there's a lot of times in the walk of a church and in the walk of an individual believer where, because in the best of heart, because we have experienced so much freedom in Christ, because he has cleaned up so much in us, because he has fixed so much in us, we encounter someone who is in a desperate mess at the feet of Jesus, and we want to fix them before we want to free them. And we can't do that. We got to follow the model of Jesus and worry about freeing people and their souls before we worry about fixing what is wrong with them, because that is really the job of the Holy Spirit. And we're supposed to just play a supporting role. Are we okay? Are we ready to go on from this just a little bit? Because what is going to happen next? I mean, you're there, and Legion is begging, please don't send us out of the region. Why would he even say that? Because this region was not only a Gentile region, it was a region full of idol worship, full of all kinds of sin, full of all kinds of things that would be a happy place for a demon to hang out. It's a good hunting ground. The fish are plenty here. And Jesus isn't the only one teaching people to fish for souls. So it says in verses 11 to 13, a large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them. He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. This is one of those things when you first read in Scripture, you're kind of like, huh? Like, what is up with the pigs? I mean, why were there even pigs? I thought pigs weren't allowed. Well, remember, this is Gentile territory, so bacon is on the menu. Roasted pork butt is a thing. It's okay for them. So why is this whole thing in here? Why is this detail important? 2,000 pigs. I want you to think about if we had, I don't know, if this were cattle land, and the local cattlemen had a herd of 2,000 head of cattle. And I want you to think before tractors and tractor supply and before there was machinery, I want you to think of the economic impact of a herd of 2,000 for jobs, for food, for taxes to the Roman government, for bacon to the Roman soldiers. 2,000. In a region controlled by the Roman soldiers, this is a tremendous source of income. It's a tremendous source of food. It's a tremendous source of livelihood. And it is suddenly run off a cliff and drown. And why did the demons even ask for this? Like, you got to remember that God is all-knowing, omniscient. He has no timeline. He can see it all. Satan is not. Like, I think maybe the demons thought they were getting one over on him. Like, they don't like pigs. Those Jews don't like pigs anyway. So we'll just ask if we can go to the pigs. That's dirty enough. He'll consign us to the pigs, and then we can wait a little while and begin to wreak havoc again. Of course, Jesus knew what was going to happen, and they did not only not have the upper hand, it was their demise. But remember, Jesus is not there on happenstance. Jesus is there on a divine appointment. And it actually has nothing to do with pigs. It has everything to do with this man and the need for him to be free. And just like Jesus wasn't surprised or deterred by the storm, he isn't surprised or deterred by the perishing of the pigs, but he is focused on the man who is now free in front of him. And we still have the disciples behind him, I would imagine, because it doesn't say any of them were up there with the man or with Jesus, watching. And I want you to remember that the teacher called the disciples to the other side, knowing what they were about to witness, knowing what they were about to encounter. And they might have thought that it was a demonic ambush, but Jesus knew there was a plan. And I want to promise you that no matter how bizarre or scary or strange the situation looks, if God has called you to it, it is part of his purpose. So when he calls you to the other side, not only be strong and courageous because he's with you, but be confident knowing that he's got you there on purpose, because just because we can't see it doesn't mean it isn't God's plan. Last week, as Sanji mentioned, those disruptions are often the very thing that God is using to stretch and grow our faith. Mark 5:14-17. Why don't you guys read with me? Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and told the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. So they told about the man and they told about the pigs, and the people came back and began to plead with Jesus to leave the region. By the way, I want to remind you, there weren't cars or motorcycles or bicycles like they ran off to the villages. That we're talking about some time passes. I don't even know if it's the same night or the next morning. What I do know is they come back, and there's the man sitting, dressed and in his right mind. Side note, I wonder which one of the disciples Jesus was like, go get your extra clothes. What? Do what? You know, I said, give the shirt off your back, go get the extra clothes. Side note, you got to enter into these things, guys. Use your imagination, because there's so much more than what is written. Like, where did the clothes come from? Who had to give it up? Maybe he's like, I'll take your cloak and I'll take your, I don't know, but the man is dressed and in his right mind. But the people weren't rejoicing, they were afraid, because they didn't know how to handle the freedom they were witnessing. All they could think about was the naked, crazy, uncontrollable monster. And they couldn't see the human being right in front of them. Freedom can be frightening for us and for those around us. When God actually sets you free from something, it can be really scary. The thing that you have been burdened with has so controlled you that you don't know how to live outside of it. That's why we have community. That's why we walk together. That's why we lock arms. That's why you are in this word, because God will help you through the frightening. Just a side note, and it's not even something that I would say occurred to me, but rather something that, as I prayed over this passage again and again this week, and it was yesterday afternoon, late in the afternoon, because almost all our Bibles title this little section, this pericope as it's called, Jesus restores a demon-possessed man, or Jesus and the demoniac, or the demoniac. I think God's pretty irritated with us that we talk about the demoniac instead of the man who was freed. See, this isn't about the demons who went off the cliff. This is about the freed man who gets his life back. And I think the very fact that we say the demoniac causes us to look at people and see the negative and the filth and the dark and the scary, instead of looking for the freedom that desires to be let loose inside of them. that Jesus desires to set free. And so we got to keep our eyes open. And when we see someone who is really struggling and is walking in darkness, we need to be willing. And not only willing, can I suggest that we begin to actually be intentional about seeing the person and beginning to care about their freedom instead of being so focused on their bondage that we run away before Jesus can do what he wants to do in the midst of it all. Now look, there are actually so many encounters in this story. There's the disciples and their field trip to the other side. There's Legion and all that means. Like, we could deep dive. I had some references about how we're not supposed to mess around with the occult, passages from the Old Testament about witchcraft and fortune tellers and all these things that we are not supposed to dabble in. Don't dabble. There's the herdsmen who miss the mark, so worried about their financial profit that they miss the freedom sitting in front of them. But we came today to talk about Jesus' encounter with the freed man. What about him? Mark 5, verses 18 to 20 says, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him go, but said, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. Side note, this was Jesus' first trip with the disciples to the other side. He's going to go back a few more times, but this is their first escapade into the unclean land with the unclean people. And here's this man, and he says, I want to go with you. Let me go with you. And Jesus is like, you can't. Now, I don't have the strong reaction I had like I did the first time I read the passage of Sanji covered last week, where you're like, Jesus, what is wrong with you? But you do read that and go, Jesus, why can't he go with you? Like, follow me. Isn't that the thing? And before we jump into some whys, let's not dismiss this man's request. Let's, again, get out of our 21st century and be in that moment. This man is in a region where everybody knew him as the naked guy who wailed and screamed and cried out and cut himself, as the guy who ran among the tombs, lived in the graveyard with the dead people, knew that he couldn't be restrained. Everybody was afraid of him. And Jesus wants him to stay. Like, isn't a fresh start mean a fresh place to have your fresh start? Like, have you ever just needed to pick up and move your life so you could start over and it didn't include staying in the same spot where everybody knew all your stuff? Where every time you walked in a room, people... Oh, Pastor Rick, maybe it's just me. Where the shame and the guilt and the desperation of who you had been makes you want to run far, far away. Not to mention that everybody was pleading with the man who had healed him to leave. So what do the people think of him? Like, Jesus caused the pigs to go off the cliff, but what, aren't you part of the root problem? And all their economy just ran off the cliff. So were they going to hold him accountable? And that's all as the man looks at the people. But I want to take you back to the desperate man who was tormented by a legion of demons. how far away would you want to be from the person who had set you free? Like, I would be terrified to leave Jesus. It's not like, what if the pigs come back? I knew what my life was like before. I don't want to let you go. And at this point, they still see everything in the physical. See, the great news in this is that once Jesus frees you, once you have a relationship with him, he never lets go of you. You are never without him again. You cannot be overcome and not have Jesus by your side to stand up for you. Not ever again. And so here's the guy, restored in his right mind, unnaked, fully clothed. And he doesn't say, hey, please, Jesus, can I go? And it's not just I think it would be a good idea. It says he begged. This was not a want to. This was the deepest desire, the desperation of his heart. And it's a little confusing because this man seems to be the entire purpose for Jesus' trip. Like, they're going to turn around and get back on the boat and go back after this. Spoiler alert. And yet, in the midst of it, Jesus won't let him go along. And Jesus instead says, go back and tell all the people. Who are all the people? All the people who are begging Jesus to leave? Let me get this straight. Here I am, I'm the guy, and I'm like, I want to go with you, Jesus. And Jesus says, no, go tell all the people. And the mob is behind me shouting, leave, Jesus, leave. I'm supposed to go tell all those people what you did for me? Does that sound inviting? Does it sound fun? Sound like sunshine and rainbows and talking chipmunks? No. And the reality is that it's really easy to follow Jesus when we agree with what he's asking us to do. But just like integrity is tested truly when nobody's watching and nobody's present to see how you walk your character out, faith is tested and proved when we are willing to surrender our will for his will. And what we want to do for the kingdom, for what God tells us to do. And this brave man, clothed and in his right mind, he did just what Jesus asked, even though it wasn't what he wanted. And we see from the text, the result was not that he was rejected, it's that the people were amazed. The people were amazed. Suddenly the people's focus was off Jesus who needed to leave, and it was on the people, it was on the man who was healed, and they were amazed. And what if he had gotten angry and said no to Jesus? What if he had given up? What if he had said, man, I must not be hearing you right, so I'm going to do what I think I need to do anyway and catch a ride on the next boat and just follow a little bit behind you so I stay where I think I need to be. Church, will we only say yes to Jesus when it's on our own terms? Will I only say yes to Jesus when it looks like what I think it should look like? Now, there's an epilogue to this story because we have the man and he stays and he does what he says. He gives a reason for the hope that he has, and it says the people were amazed. But if we step back from it, we see the enemy might have thought he got the upper hand here, getting Jesus chased out of the region. I mean, without the disruption to the economy, let me rephrase that. The enemy thought he got the upper hand when this disruption to the economy got Jesus kicked out. Kicked out, air quotes. how far would the story have gone without the disruption to the economy? I mean, the proof is not in the pudding here, folks. The proof is in the pork. An entire economy collapses, we can assume. The story has validity because the pigs are gone. It's not just the man in his right mind, but the pigs are the reason the story is trending, and it's spreading from village to village to village. I mentioned a minute ago, he gave a reason for the hope that he had. My favorite evangelistic verse, 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have. Jesus said, go and tell them what I've done for you and how I had mercy on you. Jesus and the disciples weren't going to frequent the Decapolis. They had to be all throughout Jerusalem. They had to be on that side doing a lot. But Jesus leaves this man, and the next time they show up in the Decapolis, and there's a handful, in Jesus' entire ministry, a handful of times they're over there. Mark 7:31 and 32 says, then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went down through Sidon into the Sea of Galilee into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place a hand on him. You see, go and tell meant that the crowds were no longer begging Jesus to leave, but the next time they come back, they're begging Jesus to heal. Because the demoniac, the freed man, followed Jesus on Jesus' terms. Because of the words of his testimony, the next time they came back was the feeding of the 4,000, where the crowds were overwhelming. And yes, I said 4. There's a 5,000 feeding and a 4,000 feeding, if you don't know that. The crowds are so amassed at the point that Jesus comes back again that they don't even care about eating. They just stay for Jesus' teaching. They don't have food, and there are thousands because the 4,000 would have been men, which means there's probably more like 12 to 16,000 because you add in women and children. Church, whether we are being called to the other side and we don't want to go, or we are desperate to be freed from the thing that has us in bondage, or begging Jesus to leave where we are because we want to go with him and we just don't want to stay where we are. The bottom line in all of these encounters is this: when we encounter Jesus, when we say yes to Jesus, he will redirect our path and our passions to fulfill his kingdom purpose. What is your path right now? What path are you on? And have you asked God lately if it's his path? Because going with Jesus was kingdom work, but it wasn't the assignment that he had for the man. So have you checked in with God lately to see what your assignment is? And the passion, the thing that ignites you, the thing that God has planted in your heart as he has given you the desires of your heart, that thing that gives you life, that is life-giving and exciting for you, is it on track with God's purpose for it? Or have you hijacked your passion to do something else? And will you allow Jesus to redirect you so that that thing that you might use for a bubble of 10 people becomes the thing that impacts thousands? and brings you freedom in the process, grows your faith in the process.